This is episode 2 of the Shame Proof Your Life podcast, the one where we define what shame proof even means. I'm your host and shame coach, Danita Bremer. In this podcast, I tell stories from my life to fulfill a prompting I've had for far too long. I help you tell your story in a way that you see you're not alone and there's nothing wrong with you. I want you to stop believing the lie you aren't enough so you can arise from fear and shame and shine your light unapologetically the way God intended. Okay, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me. I think it's pretty crazy that people want to hear my life stories. Yes, it's a little bit of maybe an out of the box different experience, so I get that. But I also just like I said last week, I kind of just feel like I'm a normal person and why do you want to hear my life stories? But I do thank you for tuning in and for listening. I would love to hear your feedback. I would love to know what your questions are. Sometimes I know I skip over things or forget to mention things that maybe would be really helpful for you as you're listening along. So remember that this is my story and I'm in my head. So if you do have questions about clarifying things or just curiosity questions, I'm happy to answer them. Feel free to connect with me on social media. I'm on Instagram is my favorite place. I'm also on Facebook and I'm at Danita Bremer Coaching in both places, or you can email me, Danita at danitabremer.com. Today, I want to talk about the concept I created called shame proofing your life. And I want to use a story or two from my life to sort of show you what I mean by that. And I also want to talk about my testimony of the gospel. So I want to tell you about my relationship with my grandparents. These are my dad's parents. They retired to a little town in eastern Washington state where, after my dad lost his job when I was in kindergarten, we moved to be closer to them. And I believe it was because they thought my dad could get a job nearby where they were. They became a, an incredible influence in my life. They were very calm and consistent, whereas my home life wasn't very calm or consistent at times. I mean, I guess it was consistent in its inconsistencies, but I don't know. My grandparents provided this soft place to land, this loving environment, just kind of a quieter, calmer, steadier presence for me. And I needed that as a kid. I still appreciate that. Um, and the big thing that they really gifted to me was that they started taking my sister and I to church when we moved to live near them. And this was July 4th, 1986. I had just turned 6 years old, the end of June, and we pulled up to their house on July 4th. And I remember this because my cousins were out front. It was just getting dark and they were doing sparklers. Um, and we started, I don't know how long, but probably only a few months later, my sister and I started to go to church with them. And honestly, I don't know what the motivation was for them taking us to church. I don't know if it was just to give my parents a little break from their kids. I don't know if they were like, we want our grandkids to have the gospel. I don't know if they felt guilty for not doing it. I have no idea why, but I'm pretty sure my grandparents offered that to my parents, and my parents were like, yeah, 3 to 4 hours away from our kids every week. Sure. Which, as a parent, I would totally do that too. So we went to church. We would get dressed up every week, and my parents would drop us off at their house 30 minutes or so before church started. And we would drive with my grandparents into church. And I remember being very, very shy at first and very scared, but everybody was always nice. They never made me do anything that I didn't want to do. My sister was bold and brave, and I remember being jealous of her. And my grandmother was always very involved in the children's activities. So that felt safe for me to have my grandmother there. And at the time, I was a little kid. I didn't realize what an amazing gift that would be for me. Getting a little choked up even thinking about it. But it has been such an amazing gift that my grandparents gave to me because the gospel has been such a rock in my life. Um, I have a testimony that Jesus Christ is real, that he loves us, that he died for us, that God hears our prayers. In fact, the very first prayer I ever remember being answered was a story about my grandmother. I loved her so much. I would just follow her around, whatever she was doing. And my grandparents had this giant garden and they had lots of property. Their house was on 20 acres. And so they were always puttering around the yard and the acreage. And they built their house. They hired somebody to do the foundation and like some of the really heavy work. But other than that, they put up the walls themselves. They textured the walls. They installed windows. Like they did so much. Most of their house that was built in their retirement, they did themselves. And I got to watch it all. It took several years. When I was probably, how old was I? I was probably around 8 or 9 years old. I remember it was a really hot summer day and I was hanging out with my grandmother and she said, "We're going to spray some weeds. I got to go get the wagon and the jug for the weed spray and get all my supplies together. And that's what we're going to do because it was really hot and there was no wind that day. So it was a perfect day for spraying. If there was wind, then the spray would just go away and would maybe spray plants that she didn't want to be sprayed." And so as we started to gather the supplies, she couldn't find, it was like a 2 to 3 gallon jug, like a plastic jug that the spray nozzle thing would screw onto the top of. She couldn't find it and she was getting really frustrated. She was like, "Where did I put it?" And my grandparents' house had it had an upstairs, well, it had the main level and then it had upstairs where there were bedrooms and bathroom. And then it had a walkout basement and there was a garage at the main level and a garage at the walkout basement level. And then also a carport with some storage at the walkout basement level. And then they had this like barn thing that they had built. My grandfather had goats. And so they had a bunch of storage in there. And then they had this shed. And so there were several places where this jug thing could have been. And my grandmother, I don't know how long we looked for it, maybe 30 minutes or so. And she couldn't find it. And she just got really frustrated. And she said, "Oh, forget it. I'm just going to go make some lunch." And I remember I really wanted to help her. And so I said, "Grandma, I'll be right back." And I went, I don't remember exactly where I was, but I remember praying to God and saying, "Heavenly Father, help me help grandma. I want to find the jug for her. I want to help her." And this is the first time my prayer was answered immediately and directly. I had this feeling to go look in the shed, this little shed. It was probably like 6 feet by 6 feet. I don't know, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet. And we had looked there several times, but it was full. There was a lawnmower, there were all these supplies and things. And I remember standing there in front of the door. It was just this one door and then one little room. And I started on my right side and I was just scanning across the shed until I got to like the left back corner. And this feeling overcame me. And I just knew, like it was just this knowing in my body that the jug was back there. And so I carefully climbed over some things. There was like all kinds of stuff that was probably dangerous. And there was this sheet of metal, like kind of like tin roof metal kind of stuff. And I pulled it back, and there was this jug, this plastic jug, and I pulled it out, and it kind of like had cobwebs on it. It was clearly had been there since last summer. And I ran back up to the house and I was like, "Grandma, Grandma, I found it." And she was astonished. She was like, "What? Where did you find that?" And she was thrilled, right? And I just felt so proud that I could help her. Me, this little 8-year-old, could help in some way. And that was, like I said, the first time that my prayer was really answered. And I just knew that God was real and that he listened to our prayers. I mean, how silly is it? This plastic jug for somebody who wanted to kill some weeds, right? Like, but I know that it was more than that. I know that it was the first building block of my testimony. And it was kind of like one of those things where I knew that God knew I knew, and I couldn't deny it. And so it was sort of the first real time in my life that, I don't know, that I guess I knew that God was real. And if it hadn't been for my grandparents, I would have never had that opportunity. So there were other things. Obviously, this is just one story amongst many of how my grandparents influenced me. And I mean, they didn't even really do anything specific. Yes, I watched them read their scriptures and prepare church talks and serve in their callings. And I had lots of conversations with them. I remember one time I went into my grandparents' bedroom and my grandfather was in there reading his scriptures. And I don't remember exactly like what the conversation was, but I remember him telling me the Book of Mormon is a story about the people who were in on the American continent when and before Jesus Christ was alive, right? And I was like, "Really? It is?" And so things like that. Like my dad was inactive from the church his whole entire life, and my mom wasn't a member, so my grandparents were the only influence I had. And they were completely imperfect. They didn't do family home evening. They didn't read scriptures together. We never prayed together. We never like prayed over food or morning prayers or evening prayers or anything like that. And in fact, the twice a year during general conference, they would say, "No church next week." Instead of inviting us to come to general conference with them, they would just be like, "No church next week." But I do remember them going to the temple, which was 5 hours away. So they would be gone for the weekend. And so, of course, from a gospel perspective, they were a huge influence in my life, but they were also a huge influence in my life for another reason. And that is because I felt a lot of shame around them. And I in no way blame my grandparents for this, but they were very judgmental people. It was just a product of their generation. And considering their generation, I feel like they were amazing people, but they did both grow up in Detroit, Michigan, and they were very racist. I remember one time sitting and watching TV with my grandmother, and a commercial came on with a Black family in it. And she said, "Ugh, Black people taking over the world." But I don't blame them for that. I recognized even as a kid that it was wrong. I just know that that's because that's what they were taught. And because I knew that they were judgmental, they were judgmental toward my mom. They were a lot more gentle toward my dad. I mean, he was their son, but still had some judgments, right? So I think I kind of approached them knowing they were judgmental toward people in general, and that would likely include me. And there were moments that I just remember snippets, and now I can see that it was how my brain interpreted these moments. So I just want to tell you about a couple of them. The first one was one day, I had cousins visiting at the time, and I had this one cousin who was a few years older than me, and she was really pretty, and it must have been summertime because we were outside and it was warm, and I came up behind my grandmother, she didn't see me coming, and I wrapped my arms around her and, like, kinda gave her a hug from behind, and she looked down at my hands and said, "Oh, hi, Danita," and I remember asking her, "How did you know it was me?" And she said, "Oh, well, I could tell by your fingers. Yolanda's fingers are more tapered at the end and her fingernails are different." And I remember making that mean that I wasn't as good as Yolanda. Like my fingers weren't as pretty, right? So you can see how it was just a statement. I'm sure my grandmother didn't mean anything about it other than, "I know it was you and not her." But I took it to mean like, I'm not as good. There's something wrong with me. And then the other experience I had with my grandparents, one of the standards of the church is that we don't date until we're 16. But I started dating when I was 14 years old, kind of at the encouragement of my parents. But then when my grandparents found out, they got kind of upset with me. They were like, "We know you're hanging around with this boy." He was 3 years older than me. I was 14 at the time. Now looking back, I'm like, my grandparents were probably right to be concerned about this. And they probably weren't judging me specifically, right? They probably were just wanting me to be careful and, to be safe. I mean, my mom was a teen mom. My aunt was a teen mom. Several of my cousins came from very young moms. And my grandparents took care of lots of those cousins because my aunts and uncles couldn't. So I'm sure she just was wanting me to not make some of those same mistakes. But when she said, "We know you're hanging out with this boy," and, you know, that's probably all she said. "We know you're hanging out with this boy." I felt ashamed. I knew the standards of the church. I knew what I should or shouldn't be doing. And I felt guilty about it. But instead of, which at the time I was young, I didn't have the ability to do this, but instead of taking responsibility for my own feelings, I blamed my grandparents. I was like, "They're judgmental. They don't like me. They don't want me around them. I'm just going to stay away from them." So I stopped hanging out with them as much and I stopped going to church because of my feeling, right? Because I was ashamed and I thought it was coming from them. I wanted to not be around them. So, this is the part where I kind of want to explain what it means to shame proof your life. Because here's the thing, we're all going to have shame. Shame is a human emotion. We are going to have guilt and shame. We're going to do things that are out of alignment with who we want to be, and it's not going to feel good. And that's the purpose. The purpose is to give us this little red flag of like, "Hey, something's not right according to your own standards." So I'm not suggesting that we're going to get rid of the shame because we have human brains and our brains want to protect us. So our brains are going to always be scanning for danger. And when it sees, quote unquote, sees something that seems dangerous, it's going to throw up some negative emotion because emotion is how our brains communicate with us. So we're not going to get rid of the shame, but we can know what to do with it, right? And this is why I call it shame proofing. It's like a waterproof watch. When watchmakers make a watch, they assume that there's going to be water, right? You're going to do dishes, you're going to go swimming, you're going to take a shower, whatever. There's water in our lives. It's all around us, just like shame. they're not saying, keep your watch away from the water. They create the watch to be able to withstand the water, to be able to be dropped in water so many feet or, have water splashed on it. Like there's different levels, right? There's waterproof or water resistant. So that's the same thing I want to suggest we can do with shame. Shame is going to be there, but we can prepare ourselves to know how to respond to the shame, how to deal with the shame, to recognize it when it comes up for what it is, right? So there's a difference between my grandmother said words to me, we know you're hanging out with this boy, and what I make that mean, right? I made it mean I shouldn't be doing that. I'm doing something wrong. I'm bad. And then that made me feel shame and guilt. At the time, I did not know the difference between what my grandmother was saying to me and what my thought about it was and what my feeling about it was. But when we have this awareness of those three different things, we can see each thing for what it is. And we don't have to blame the other person, right? Like my grandmother is who she is. Now I think, oh my gosh, she loved me so much. She was trying to protect me. She was trying to teach me. She wasn't trying to shame me, but I made it mean that there was something wrong with me. And it was because of her words, not because of what I was thinking or believing about it. Because the truth is, I agreed with her, even as a 14-year-old, but also as a 14-year-old girl, I was like, I still want to hang out with that boy. Also, totally normal, right? So, this is what I mean by shame proofing our lives. We see the shame, we know it's coming from our thoughts or the meanings that we place upon whatever is happening. So, that could be abuse or trauma, or it could just be like yelling at your kids, right? Something that almost every parent does. Some parents feel guilty about it or ashamed about it, and some don't, right? So teasing apart, like, what is the fact of the situation? In this situation, my grandmother's words were the fact. What are the thoughts you're having? My thoughts were, there's something wrong with me. I shouldn't be doing this. And my feelings that came from those thoughts were guilt and shame. And then the action was to stop hanging out with my grandparents, right? So I loved my grandparents. I didn't want to stop hanging out with them, but I thought I had to. I thought that was the only choice I had. Now, looking back and knowing what I know about the life coaching tools I've learned, I totally could have been like, oh, I'm feeling ashamed about this. What's that all about? This doesn't match up with who I want to be ultimately. Maybe I could make some changes. Maybe I can make some different decisions or take some different action. Or maybe I could feel ashamed and still do what I'm doing, but also love my grandparents and also be willing to hang out with them, right? That's what I'm talking about with shame proofing our lives. It opens us up to so many more options available to us. Here is the exercise for you to do today. Sit down with a piece of paper and a writing utensil and write down. You could do this with bullets or sentences, whatever, make it as easy on yourself as possible. Write down all the reasons why you don't feel like you're good enough. And don't filter it, right? Now that you kind of have this little bit of knowledge about, oh, it's not the other person's words that created my shame, pretend for a second you don't know that. And just write down all the reasons why you feel shame. It could be um, because I started dating when I was 16, because I yelled at my kids, because I didn't get straight A's, because whatever, right? Like whatever the reasons are that your brain thinks that you feel ashamed, Just dump them all out on paper. Now, once they're all dumped out, go back and look at that list of all those things and recognize that each one of those things is your thought. It's your thought that creates shame for you. And that's as far as I want you to go, because the hardest part about doing this work of shame proofing your life is going to be gaining awareness. And here's the other thing, I do not want you to judge yourself. Once we have this knowledge that it's my own thoughts that create my feelings, we have a tendency to be like, well, if it's me doing it, then I shouldn't do that. Like, I blame myself for it. So we go from blaming grandma for saying whatever she said to blaming me. And neither of those are going to be helpful. I just want you to see that it's a thought. It's a thought that creates your shame. It's not the other person. It's not what you did or what you didn't do. It's the thought, the meaning that your brain placed on those actions from the other person or from you. And there's no blame here because your brain has a really good reason for it. It feels protective. Listen, when we feel shame, we withdraw, we hide, and that is very protective. So that is how your brain knew at the time to protect you from feeling hurt and from feeling negative emotion. Now we can gain some awareness around it. We can be like, oh, this is awesome. My brain has all these thoughts that cause shame for me. They're thoughts that my brain has a really good reason for thinking because my brain is trying to protect me and keep me alive, right? So it's going to be easy for you to blame yourself, but resist blaming yourself. It's going to be so much more helpful if you don't blame yourself. And if you just see everything as like, this is just a thought that my brain had for whatever reason that causes shame. I don't like feeling shame. Can I see that it's my thought causing it and not the other person or not the thing I did or not the thing I didn't do? Right? And awareness, it's like an iceberg analogy. The tip of the iceberg is what we see, and awareness is what is underneath the water that we don't see. It's all of the stuff that our brain gives to us that we don't even see as thoughts because our brain is the creator of the thoughts. So it's hard for it to kind of look at itself. So this is a skill that you learn, is to be the watcher of your thoughts, but it does take time to learn that skill. Okay, that is enough for now. And so are you. Until next time, go be you and follow the spirit. Thanks for joining me here on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed that. And like I said at the top of the hour, feel free to reach out, comment, and let me know what your questions are, what your curiosities are. I'm happy to answer.